Welcome to our newest episode about Russian Revolution. Subscribe our channel and enjoy. The Russian Revolution was a series of political and social events that occurred in Russia between 1917 and 1922. The revolution saw the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy and the establishment of the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state. The causes of the Russian Revolution can be traced back to the 19th century, with the Tsarist autocracy facing widespread discontent among the Russian people. The country was struggling economically, and there was a growing sense of social and political inequality, with the working classes and peasants facing poverty and oppression while the ruling classes lived in luxury. The Russian people also suffered from a lack of political freedom, with the Tsarist regime suppressing any attempts at dissent or reform. This led to a growing sense of frustration and anger among the Russian people, which eventually boiled over into revolution. The revolution began in February 1917, with the February Revolution in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. The city was facing food shortages, high prices, and a lack of political freedom, which led to widespread protests and demonstrations. The Tsarist regime responded with force, using the army to quell the protests. However, the protests continued to grow, with workers and soldiers joining the demonstrations. The Tsar was eventually forced to abdicate, and a provisional government was established. The provisional government was made up of members of the Russian parliament, the Duma, who were tasked with governing Russia until a more permanent government could be established. However, the provisional government was weak and unable to address the demands of the Russian people. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, saw an opportunity to seize power and establish a socialist government in Russia. Lenin returned to Russia from exile in Switzerland and began to organize the Bolsheviks for a revolution. The Bolsheviks believed that the time was right for a socialist revolution, as the provisional government was weak, and the Russian people were desperate for change. They also believed that they could win the support of the working classes and peasants by promising to redistribute land and wealth and end the ongoing war effort. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks staged a coup and seized power in what became known as the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd, where the provisional government was based, and arrested members of the government, effectively ending their rule. Following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks established a socialist government and began implementing policies that redistributed land and wealth and nationalized industry. These policies were met with resistance from many factions in Russia, including the White Army, made up of anti-communist forces. The civil war that followed lasted from 1918 to 1922 and resulted in the deaths of millions of Russians. The Red Army, led by the Bolsheviks, ultimately emerged victorious, and the Soviet Union was established in 1922. The storming of the Winter Palace on October 25, 1917, was one of the most significant events of the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks, along with other revolutionary groups, stormed the palace and arrested members of the provisional government, effectively ending their rule. The storming of the Winter Palace was a symbolic victory for the Bolsheviks, as it represented the end of the Tsarist autocracy and the beginning of a new era in Russian history. One of the most tragic events that occurred during the Russian Revolution was the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family by the Bolsheviks. After the October Revolution, the Tsar and his family were held in custody in various locations, including the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo and the Ipatov House in Ekaterinburg. In July 1918, the decision was made to execute the Tsar and his family, as the Bolsheviks feared that they could become a rallying point for anti-communist forces. On the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, the Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants were led to a basement in the Ipatov house and executed by a firing squad. The execution of the Tsar and his family was a brutal act that demonstrated the brutality of the Bolshevik regime and the lengths they were willing to go to establish their power. Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks and played a crucial role in the Russian Revolution. After the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, Lenin became the leader of the new socialist government. Lenin's policies emphasized the centralization of power, industrialization, and collectivization of agriculture. He also implemented policies that sought to eliminate opposition to the Bolsheviks, including the establishment of the Cheka, a secret police force that carried out acts of violence and repression against those seen as a threat to the regime. Despite his role in establishing the Soviet Union, Lenin's legacy is mixed, with some seeing him as a visionary leader who helped to establish a new socialist society, while others view him as a brutal dictator who was responsible for widespread violence and repression. The civil war that followed the Russian Revolution saw the Bolsheviks fighting against anti-communist forces, including the White Army, made up of a diverse group of factions united in their opposition to the Bolsheviks. The civil war was fought throughout Russia and in neighboring countries, including Poland, Finland, and Ukraine. The Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, was better organized and better equipped than the White Army, which was often disorganized and lacked a unified command structure. The battles between the Red and White armies were brutal, with both sides committing acts of violence and atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. The Red Army ultimately emerged victorious, and the Soviet Union was established in 1922. The Red Terror was a period of violence and repression carried out by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. The Bolsheviks saw themselves as a vanguard of the working classes and believed that they needed to eliminate any opposition to establish a socialist society. The Red Terror saw the establishment of the Chaika, a secret police force that carried out acts of violence and repression against those seen as a threat to the regime. The Chaika carried out mass arrests, executions, and other forms of violence against political opponents, intellectuals, and members of the bourgeoisie. The Red Terror was a brutal period that demonstrated the lengths to which the Bolsheviks were willing to go to establish their power. It resulted in the deaths of thousands of Russians and was a significant factor in the establishment of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution was a complex and tumultuous period in Russian history that saw the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy and the establishment of the Soviet Union. Despite its legacy of violence and repression, the Russian Revolution was a pivotal moment in world history that fundamentally transformed the political and social landscape of Russia and had far-reaching effects on the global stage. The establishment of the Soviet Union represented a new era in world history, and the revolutionary ideas that emerged from the Russian Revolution had a profound impact on leftist politics around the world. The Russian Revolution also sparked a period of intense ideological conflict between communism and capitalism that dominated world politics throughout the 20th century. Despite its flaws, the revolution represented a turning point in world history and set the stage for the ideological conflicts that would shape the 20th century. Thank you for watching. Subscribe our channel and see you in next episodes.